She was 4 years old, and the man who was supposed to protect her told police she had been taken by strangers, but the strangers never existed. Before we dive in, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we uncover another case that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. There are cases that break communities. There are cases that break cities. And then there are cases that reach down into something deeper, into the understanding people carry, quietly and without examination, that children are safe in their own homes, that the people who call themselves family are the ones who mean it. The case of Maleah Davis broke that understanding for Houston, Texas, and for anyone who followed it anywhere in the country. It broke it slowly, over weeks of searching and deception, and a story that kept changing. And it ended in a confession so matter-of-fact, so stripped of remorse, that the people who heard it could barely process what they were listening to. Maleah Davis was 4 years old. She had been through more in her short life than most people face in decades. She had survived surgeries. She had survived a heart condition that required medical interventions most adults would not be able to name. She had survived a childhood that had been, from the very beginning, marked by instability and uncertainty. And then, in the spring of 2019, she did not survive the man her mother had brought into their home. This is her story. It deserves to be told fully and carefully, and with the respect that was not extended to her in the last days of her life. Maleah Lynn Davis was born on August 2nd, 2014, in Houston, Texas. She was the third child of Brittany Bowens, a young woman whose own life had been marked by difficulty and whose choices, in the years that followed Maleah's birth, would be scrutinized and debated in ways that are both understandable and, in some respects, unfair to the complexity of circumstances that shape a person's decisions. From the beginning, Maleah's medical needs were significant. She had been born with a condition affecting her heart, and in the first years of her life, she underwent multiple surgeries to address it. The surgeries left her physically small for her age. At 4 years old, she was closer in size to a 2-year-old, and they left visible scars that her family described as marks of her toughness, evidence of a child who had already fought hard to be here. Despite the medical challenges, by all accounts from people who knew her, Maleah was a child of extraordinary brightness and personality. She was described as energetic, curious, talkative in the way that 4-year-olds are talkative, with a directness and a confidence that makes adults smile. She loved purple. She loved playing. She had a laugh that people remembered. She was the kind of child who made you feel, in her presence, that the world was fundamentally more interesting than you had previously understood it to be. To understand the full scope of what was lost when Maleah Davis died, it helps to understand how much she had already endured before the spring of 2019 and how much she had already overcome. Her first heart surgery took place when she was still an infant. In the condition she was born with, a congenital heart defect, required intervention that most adults would find overwhelming to contemplate. She was placed under anesthesia. Surgeons operated on her heart. She recovered. She went home. She grew. Not as fast as other children, because the surgeries and the recovery and the ongoing monitoring of her condition meant that her body devoted energy to healing that other children's bodies devoted to growing. But she grew. She walked and talked and laughed and played and became, by age 4, the specific, particular person that her family describes when they speak about her. The scars from her surgeries were visible. Her family described them as marks of her strength, as evidence that she had already fought battles that most people never face. For a child so small, 33 pounds, 3 feet 2 inches, the size of a 2-year-old in a 4-year-old's world, the scars were a particularly vivid contrast. Something large and serious had been done to and for this small body. Something large and serious had been survived. The medical history also meant that Maleah had a particular relationship with hospitals and doctors that most 4-year-olds do not have. She had been in medical environments more times than she could count. She had been monitored and evaluated and treated in ways that create, in some children, either a deep wariness of medical settings or a kind of familiarity that borders on comfort. Her family's account suggests the latter, that Maleah moved through the world with a confidence that her medical history, rather than undermining, had somehow reinforced. She had been through hard things and had come out on the other side of them. At 4 years old, she already had evidence that she was someone who survived. The cruelty of what followed is not reducible to any single fact. Sure, but this one is among the most difficult. A child who had survived so much, who had been fought for so hard by her body and by the medical professionals who treated her and by the family who loved her, was killed by an act of human choice. Not by illness, not by the random workings of biology, not by any of the forces that had threatened her before, by a choice, by a person who decided that her life was expendable. There is a specific quality to that cruelty that is worth naming. She was not taken by something that could not have been stopped. She was taken by something that should have been stopped and was not. The neighborhood where the family lived in Missouri City, a suburb southwest of Houston, is a community of working families in modest houses and the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. It is not a dangerous place in any statistical sense. It does not carry the profile of a neighborhood that people associate with violent crime. What happened to Maleah Davis happened in the kind of place where people do not expect it to happen, which is to say that it happened in the same kind of place where harm to children always happens. In private, behind closed doors, in the space between what a family presents to the world and what actually occurs when the world is not watching. The apartment where Maleah lived was her home. It was supposed to be the safest place in her world, the place where she slept and ate and played and was cared for by the people responsible for her. The transformation of that space into the place where she died is one of the specific violations of this case that communities find hardest to process because it removes the possibility of safety by proximity. If a child is not safe in her own home, with the adults designated to protect her, then the geography of safety collapses entirely. This is why cases involving the death of a child at the hands of a caretaker produce a particular kind of grief in communities. The grief is not just for the specific child, it is for the category of certainty that the case removes. The quiet assumption that children are safe at home, that whatever dangers exist in the wider world, the immediate environment of family provides protection. That assumption does not survive cases like Maleah's intact. It becomes something more provisional, more anxious, more qualified. Parents hold their children differently after reading about cases like this, not because the statistical risk in their specific home has changed, but because the imagination of risk has expanded to include the place it was supposed to be excluded from. Brittany Bowens, Maleah's mother, had 3 children. In the period before Maleah's disappearance, she had become involved with a man named Darian Vence. Vence, who was in his late 20s, moved into the family home and took on a role in the children's lives that was, at least nominally, that of a stepfather figure. He and Brittany were engaged. The relationship appeared from the outside to have the ordinary features of a family working towards some version of stability. But the relationship between Darian Vence and Maleah, by the accounts that would emerge later, was not ordinary. People who knew the family described tension. Maleah's biological father, Craig Davis, had concerns about the child's welfare in Vence's presence. He had, in the period before Maleah's disappearance, been seeking to have his parental rights recognized and had expressed unease about Vence. These concerns were documented. They did not produce the intervention that might have changed what happened. The events that brought Maleah Davis to national attention began on Friday, April 26, 2019. That evening, Darian Vence was alone with Maleah and a second child, Maleah's brother, at the family's apartment in the Missouri City area outside Houston. Brittany Bowens was in the hospital. She had recently given birth to another child and was recovering. Vence had been left in charge. At some point late that evening, Vence drove with the 2 children to the George Bush Intercontinental Airport area in North Houston. What he was doing there, why he had driven from Missouri City to the north end of a major metropolitan area with 2 small children late at night, it was a question that would take weeks and eventually a confession to partially answer. Shortly after midnight on Saturday, April 27th, Vence appeared at a Houston hospital, Memorial Hermann Hospital in the Texas Medical Center, with Maleah's brother, but without Maleah. He told hospital staff and then police that he had been driving on a highway when he noticed a tire problem on his vehicle. He had pulled over, a truck had stopped. Men had gotten out of the truck. The men had spoken to him. Hona, and then in a scenario that already defied ordinary credibility, had forced both him and the two children into the truck and driven away with them. He described being held for an indeterminate period. He described being dumped on the side of a road. He described that when the men let him go, they had kept Maleah. He described her being taken away in the truck. He said he did not know who the men were, or why they had taken her specifically, or where they had gone. He had a cut on his head that he said was consistent with being struck. He appeared distressed. The Houston Police Department initiated a search. An Amber Alert was issued for Maleah Davis. The description was broadcast. 4 years old, 3 feet 2 inches tall, approximately 33 pounds. Brown eyes, black hair, with a medical scar on her chest. Last seen in a purple outfit. The search was immediate and broad. Law enforcement worked through the weekend and into the following week. Her tip lines were flooded. Community volunteers organized search efforts. The story was on local and then national news. A 4-year-old girl, already notable for her medical history and her small size, taken by strangers in the middle of the night on the side of a Houston highway. The story from the beginning had details that investigators found difficult to reconcile. The location where Vince said the vehicle trouble had occurred was far from where he and Brittany lived. Once the time of night was unusual for a family errand. The behavior Vince described, strangers pulling over, multiple men, an abduction that targeted only one of 2 small children, did not follow any coherent criminal logic. Stranger abductions of children are rare. Stranger abductions that specifically select one child while leaving another child and the adult present are essentially unheard of. Surveillance footage from the area around where Vince claimed the incident occurred was reviewed. It did not corroborate his account. Camera footage at the airport area captured Vince's vehicle. It did not show what he described. Investigators began to focus on Vince with the careful, patient attention that detectives apply when a witness's account does not align with the available evidence, but when the witness has not yet given them the specific contradiction they need. In the days following the disappearance, the community response was enormous. The Houston rallied around the search for Maleah with the collective energy that major cities sometimes produce in response to the disappearance of a child. Search teams organized, community members walked fields and checked drainage areas. Social media amplified the Amber Alert. The face of Maleah Davis, round and smiling in the photographs her family provided, wearing purple, looking exactly like the kind of child who makes you want to stop and make sure she's okay, was everywhere. Quanell X, a Houston civil rights activist with long experience in advocacy and community organization, became involved in the search and served as a prominent spokesperson for the family's interests during the investigation. His involvement brought additional attention and also additional pressure on investigators to produce answers. He was direct in his public statements about the urgency of finding Maleah, and he would later play a role in events that no one anticipated at the time. As the search entered its second week, the discrepancies in Vince's account accumulated. Investigators noted the timeline problems. They noted the geographic inconsistencies. They noted that Vince's behavior in the hours and days following Maleah's disappearance was, at various points, difficult to square with that of a person genuinely desperate to find a missing child. On May 4, 2019, Darian Vince was arrested. The charge was tampering with evidence, specifically with a human corpse. And the charge carried a specific and devastating implication. Investigators believed that Maleah Davis was dead and that Vince knew where her remains were. The arrest did not produce an immediate confession. Vince was held on bond. The search for Maleah continued, now shaped by the grim understanding that what was being sought was most likely not a living child. Then something unusual happened, or something that reflects the complexity of this case and the desperate desire of everyone involved for the truth to emerge. Quanell X, who had been serving as an advocate for the family, requested and received permission to speak privately with Darian Vince while Vince was in custody. The conversation that followed, conducted outside the formal structure of a police interrogation, produced a result that formal interrogation had not. Vince confessed to Quanell X. He admitted that Maleah was dead. He admitted that the story about the men in the truck was a fabrication. He told Quanell X that Maleah had been injured, that she had died, and that he had disposed of her body. He provided a location, a stretch of highway in Arkansas along Interstate 30 near the town of Hope. Quinnell X went public with the confession the following day. On May 9, 2019, search teams converged on the area along Interstate 30 in Arkansas that Vence had indicated. In a heavily wooded area near the highway, in a bag, in a location consistent with Vence's description, investigators found the remains of Maleah Davis. She was identified through forensic analysis. The manner of death was determined to be homicide. She had been missing for 13 days. The formal investigation into Maleah's death and the charges against Darian Vence moved forward through the Texas criminal justice system with the methodical weight of a case that had attracted enormous public attention and in which the basic facts, however devastating, were not substantially in dispute. Vence had confessed informally to Quinnell X. The remains had been found. The forensic evidence was extensive. The question that remained, the question that any homicide prosecution must answer, and that this one had to answer in the full view of a public that had spent weeks watching and searching and hoping, was what exactly had happened to Maleah Davis in the hours before Darian Vence appeared at a Houston hospital without her. The picture that emerged from the investigation was one of particular cruelty. The specifics of Maleah's injuries, as established by the forensic and medical examination, indicated that she had been subjected to physical abuse that was not consistent with an accident. The nature and pattern of the injuries, which prosecutors would detail extensively in the case against Vence, pointed to violence inflicted deliberately on a small child who had no means of defense and no avenue of escape. Maleah had been in the care of the person who harmed her. She had been in the home where she lived. She had been, by every reasonable expectation, safe. Darian Vence was indicted on a charge of capital murder in connection with Maleah's death. The capital murder charge in Texas carries the possibility of the death penalty, which prosecutors indicated they would seek. The case proceeded through pretrial proceedings over the following months and years, accumulating the documentation and preparation that a capital case requires. In September 2020, more than a year after Maleah's remains were found, Darian Vence entered a guilty plea to the capital murder charge. Under the terms of the plea, he would not face the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 27 years old at sentencing. The plea avoided a trial, which meant it avoided the specific, detailed public presentation of evidence about what Maleah experienced in her final hours. For some members of the family and the community, the guilty plea was a relief. It meant not having to sit through weeks of testimony about things that cannot be made better by being heard repeatedly in a courtroom. For others, the absence of a trial meant the absence of a full public accounting, a full record, a full documentation of what Vence had done. Maleah's biological father, Craig Davis, had been fighting for his daughter before her death and continued to seek accountability afterward. He had raised concerns about Vence's presence in Maleah's life. He had sought to have his parental rights formally recognized. He had done what a father can do within a system that does not always move as quickly as circumstances require. His grief after Maleah's death was compounded by the specific anguish of a person who feared the outcome and was not able to prevent it. Brittany Bowens, Maleah's mother, was in the hospital when her daughter was killed. She was not present in the apartment on the evening of April 26th. The question of her knowledge of any prior abuse, of the warning signs that preceded the final night, is one that has been examined and debated and that does not admit of simple answers. Bowens has stated publicly that she did not know, that she trusted Vence, that the loss of Maleah is a wound she will carry for the rest of her life. Whether that is the complete picture is a question the legal system did not fully pursue. Bowens was not charged with any crime in connection with Maleah's death. The Child Protective Service's history in Maleah's case was a dimension that received significant attention in the aftermath of the murder. Texas CPS had been involved with the family at various points prior to Maleah's death. The specifics of those interactions, what was reported, what was investigated, what was found, when and what was done with the findings, became the subject of intense scrutiny from the public, from advocacy organizations, and from legislators. The basic question was one that comes up in cases like this with painful regularity. Were there warning signs that the system had the opportunity to act on and did not? Were there moments when a different decision, a different assessment, a different intervention, a different response to a report might have produced a different outcome for Maleah? The Texas Department of Family and Protective Services conducted a review of the prior CPS involvement with the family. The results of that review, made public in the months following Maleah's death, identified areas where the agency's practices and decision-making could have been different. The review was careful in its language, the language of institutional self-assessment, which tends toward acknowledgement of general inadequacy rather than specific accountability. But the underlying finding was not difficult to read. The system had touched this family. The system had not prevented what happened to Maleah. This is one of the permanent structural realities of Child Protective Services work. CPS agencies across the country are chronically underfunded, chronically understaffed, and chronically asked to make high-stakes decisions about family safety with incomplete information, under time pressure, and without the resources that the complexity of the work requires. Individual caseworkers are often carrying caseloads that no human being can manage with the attention each case deserves. Decisions that look obvious in retrospect, when a child is dead and all the prior warning signs are visible in a complete file, are genuinely difficult in real time, and when the picture is incomplete and the pressures are multiple. This is not an exculpation of any specific failure in Maleah's case. It is a context. The specific failures matter, and the review found them. But they did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in a system that is asked to do more than it has the resources to do, and the predictable consequence of that structural deficit is that children fall through the gaps. Maleah Davis fell through a gap. She fell through it despite being small enough and sick enough and visibly enough in need of protection that anyone who looked at her should have understood she was vulnerable. She fell through it in a city that would spend weeks organizing volunteer search teams and flooding tip lines and wallpapering social media with her photograph. A city that cared enormously when it became clear that she was missing. The gap between that collective caring and the institutional failure that preceded her death is one of the more disorienting features of the case. Houston's response to the search for Maleah was, in many respects, extraordinary. The city came together with a solidarity and urgency that reflected genuine community love for a child most people had never met. Churches organized. Schools sent flyers home with students. Volunteer search coordinators managed teams of dozens. The tip line received hundreds of calls. Billboards displayed her photograph. And all of it came too late. The community mobilized after Maleah was already dead because the people who had the authority to act before that, the system that was supposed to identify and respond to children at risk, had not moved quickly enough or decisively enough in the moments when movement and decisiveness might have mattered. That is the hardest part of this story. Not the crime itself, so as horrific as it is, but the accumulation of moments before the crime when different choices were available and different choices were not made. The father raising concerns, the CPS involvement that did not produce intervention, the engagement of a fiancé about whom questions existed. Each of those moments was a place where the story could have gone differently, and each of them passed without the redirection that Maleah needed. What happened to Maleah Davis in the apartment on the evening of April 26, 2019, is known in its general outlines from the forensic evidence and from Vence's eventual admissions. The specific details, the specific sequence of events, the specific nature of the violence, are part of the prosecution record available in the legal documents of the case. They are not reproduced here, because the purpose of this account is not to document suffering in detail, but to understand how a 4-year-old child came to be in a position where that suffering was possible, and what the case tells us about the systems that were supposed to prevent it. What can be said, and what the forensic record establishes, is that Maleah Davis died as a result of injuries inflicted by the adult who was supposed to be caring for her. She died alone with him, while she had no one else present to protect her or to call for help. She was 4 years old and approximately 33 pounds, and she had already survived multiple heart surgeries, and she had done everything a child can possibly do to be here, to keep fighting, to stay. and she was taken from the world by a person who had no right to take anything from her. The fabricated story that Vence told, the strangers, the truck, the highway abduction, was constructed quickly enough that it could be delivered to hospital staff and police within hours. It had internal logic, at least on the surface. It included details specific enough to seem like memory rather than invention. It was, in the parlance of investigators, a story that had been prepared rather than simply recalled. What it did not have was corroboration. And as the days wore on and the surveillance footage was reviewed and the witness canvassing produced nothing and the tip line leads failed to pan out, the absence of corroboration became the loudest thing about the story. The truck did not appear on cameras. The men did not appear in any record. The interaction Vence described left no trace in the world because it had never happened. The details Vence did get right, the ambient detail of the highway, the late hour, the geographic setting, were all things he knew because he had been there. The things he got wrong were the things that required him to invent other people, other vehicles, a sequence of events that had not occurred. The incoherence of the story grew more visible as the investigation progressed until the formal charge of evidence tampering made explicit what investigators had been communicating implicitly for days. They did not believe him. The question of why Vence chose a fabricated abduction story rather than any other form of concealment is one that forensic psychologists and investigators have examined in a range of cases involving the death of a child at a caretaker's hands. The answer, in most such cases, involves a combination of factors: the need for immediate cover, the hope that the child's body will not be found or will not be identified quickly, and a fundamental miscalculation about the sophistication of the investigation that will follow. The abduction story provides an alternative narrative. Someone else did this. And it provides a reason for the child's absence that does not implicate the person telling the story. It almost never works. It did not work here. What it did do was extend the period of uncertainty by nearly 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which a community searched, and a father waited for news of his daughter. And the truth sat inside Darian Vence, while he told a story that had no strangers in it, because there had been none. The role of Quinnell X in bringing the confession to light is one of the more unusual features of the case, and it deserves examination for what it reveals about the limits and opportunities of informal intervention in criminal investigations. Quinnell X has been a prominent figure in Houston's African-American community for decades, with a history of involvement in cases involving police misconduct, community advocacy, and the rights of families who felt unheard by official institutions. His involvement in the Maleah Davis case was, at least initially, in that advocacy capacity, pushing for a more aggressive search, amplifying the family's voice, maintaining pressure on investigators. His private meeting with Vence and the confession that resulted was not part of any official investigative strategy. It was a conversation between two people, one of whom ultimately decided that maintaining the lie was no longer something he was willing or able to do in the presence of someone asking him directly. Whatever the psychological mechanism, guilt, the specific character of the confrontation, the weight of the accumulated deception, Vence told Quinnell X the truth when he had not told the police the truth through the full structure of formal interrogation. This raises questions that are worth sitting with. Questions about what kinds of conversations produce truth and what kinds of institutional settings make truth harder to reach. Questions about the role of community figures and informal interlocutors in cases where formal processes have stalled. Questions about what it means that a man confessed to the murder of a 4-year-old child in a private meeting in a way that he had not confessed in any official capacity. When these questions do not have clean answers, the confession Vence gave to Quinnell X led directly to the recovery of Maleah's remains and to the certainty of prosecution. Whatever the mechanism, it produced a result that formal investigation had not yet produced. The value of that result, for the family and for the community, and for the possibility of any form of justice, is not diminished by the informality of the context in which it was obtained. In the years since Maleah's death, her case has been cited in advocacy and legislative discussions about child protective services reform in Texas. The Texas legislature took up questions related to CPS caseloads, reporting requirements, and the standards for intervention in homes where children have identified medical vulnerabilities. The specific legislative outcomes were incremental. Reform in this area is always incremental because the systemic problems are large and the political will to address them fully is rarely equal to the scale of the problem. But the fact that Maleah's case was part of the conversation that produced even incremental change is worth noting. Her case was also part of a broader national conversation about children at risk and the obligations of the systems that are supposed to protect them. That conversation includes the names of too many children. It includes children who died in foster care, and children who died with parents who had been reported to CPS, and children who died despite the involvement of every institution that is supposed to stand between a vulnerable child and the violence that finds them. Maleah Davis is one name in that conversation, and the specific features of her case, the prior CPS involvement, the father's documented concerns, but the system's failure to act with sufficient urgency make her story a useful one for understanding what reform requires. But she is not primarily a policy argument. She is a child. She was a specific, particular child who loved purple and had a laugh people remembered and had already fought for her own life in operating rooms before she was old enough to understand what fighting meant. And she was 4 years old, and she was trusting the world to be safe the way 4-year-olds are supposed to be able to trust it, and the world was not safe in the specific place and time where she needed it to be. The weeks between April 27th and May 9th, 2019, between the night Vence appeared at the hospital without Maleah and the day her remains were found in Arkansas, were weeks that Houston lived in a specific suspended state. The community knew, much with the instinct that communities develop around cases like this, that the situation was likely worse than the official account allowed. But the Amber Alert was still active. The search was still ongoing. The official posture of the investigation, which had to be maintained regardless of the private assessments of investigators, was that Maleah could still be alive. So living in that suspension, holding the hope that might not be warranted while the evidence increasingly suggested the hope was misplaced, is one of the more psychologically complex aspects of a community response to a missing child case. People searched with genuine urgency. They organized with genuine belief that what they were doing might matter. They kept the faith in the formal and informal senses of that phrase, and because the alternative, accepting that a 4-year-old was already beyond finding, was not something a searching community can afford to embrace while the search is still ongoing. When the remains were found, the community's grief was enormous and immediate. The transition from searching to mourning happened in hours. The search parties dissolved into vigils. The tip lines shifted from urgent to sorrowful. The faces of the volunteers who had spent days in the field reflected the specific exhaustion of people who had worked hard for an outcome that did not come. That grief, too, is part of Maleah's story. The grief of the strangers who looked for her, the grief of the people who had shared her photograph and followed the news and checked their phones for updates before going to sleep at night, the grief of a city that had done everything the community component of child protection can do, which is a lot and which is also ultimately insufficient without the institutional components working equally well. Darian Vence is serving life in prison without parole at a Texas correctional facility. He is in his late 20s. He will be in prison for the rest of his life. Maleah Davis was laid to rest in Houston. Her funeral drew hundreds of people, many of them strangers who had spent weeks hoping for a different outcome and who came to say goodbye to a child they had never met, but had come to know through 2 weeks of searching and heartbreak. The service was marked by the particular grief of a community that had done everything it could and had not been enough, and by the particular grief of a family that had lost a child they will spend the rest of their lives wondering how to protect in retrospect. There is also the grief of Brittany Bowens, which exists in a category that is harder for the public to hold cleanly. She was in a hospital when her daughter died, recovering from childbirth, having trusted the man she was engaged to with her children for a night. The precise nature of what she knew and when she knew it, whether there were signs of prior abuse that she saw and did not act on, or signs she did not see, or signs she saw and interpreted differently than the outcome now demands, is a question that the legal system did not fully resolve, and that the public discourse around the case engaged with at varying levels of charity and accuracy. What can be said with fairness is that her loss is real. The death of a child you carried and delivered and named and raised for 4 years is a loss that does not have a clean shape. And it does not have a clean shape even when the circumstances of that death implicate questions about your own choices and your own relationships. Grief and guilt and love and culpability do not organize themselves neatly when a child dies. The internal landscape of a surviving parent in circumstances like these is not something that can be adjudicated from outside. Brittany Bowens lost Maleah. She will lose her every day for the rest of her life. Whatever the full account of the decisions that preceded the loss itself is real and permanent. Craig Davis, Maleah's biological father, has spoken publicly about his daughter in the years since her death. He speaks about her with the specific, grounded love of a person who knew a real child rather than a symbol, who knew the way she moved through a room and the things that made her laugh and the stubborn, a particular personality of a 4-year-old who had already survived more than she should have had to survive. He speaks about her with grief that has not diminished with time, because grief of that kind does not diminish. It changes shape, and it becomes something a person learns to carry, but it does not go away. He has spoken about the failure of the system to act on his concerns. He has spoken about the specific moments when he felt the machinery of child protection moving too slowly, in the wrong direction, or not at all. He has spoken about these things not to assign blame as an end in itself, but because the assignment of blame is the necessary precondition for the kind of systemic change that might mean that the next child in a similar situation gets a different outcome. That is the note on which cases like this must be left, not with a resolution. There is no resolution to the death of a 4-year-old child, not with closure. Closure in any meaningful sense. Attorney is not available when the person who needed protection did not receive it, but with the insistence that understanding what went wrong is the only way to do something about what comes next. Maleah Davis deserved to grow up. She deserved to learn what purple means to a 5-year-old, and a 10-year-old, and a 20-year-old. She deserved to find out what kind of person she was becoming, what she would love as she grew into the years she never had. Sure, she deserved the ordinary accumulated experience of a life that continues, that surprises you with what it becomes, that takes turns you didn't anticipate, that gives you the chance to find out who you are on the other side of everything that happens. She deserved all of it, and she did not receive any of it. And the people and systems that should have ensured she received it did not do what they needed to do. The city of Houston in the spring of 2019 was a city that had already, when in recent years, been tested by catastrophe. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 had flooded entire neighborhoods and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. The recovery from that disaster was still ongoing in parts of the city. Houston had demonstrated, during Harvey and in the years that followed, a particular kind of communal resilience, an ability to organize, to show up for strangers, to treat the suffering of people it did not personally know as a collective responsibility. That same instinct activated for Maleah Davis. When the Amber Alert went out, when the face of a 4-year-old girl in a purple outfit began circulating on phones and televisions and social media feeds across the city, Houston responded with the energy it had deployed for floods and storms. Volunteers arrived at coordination points. Neighborhood groups formed search teams, where people who had never participated in a missing person search learned the protocols quickly and went out into the heat with bottled water and determination. This is worth noting because it complicates the narrative of a city or a society that simply failed Maleah. The failure was institutional and specific. It occurred in the particular mechanisms of child protective services, in the processing of a father's concerns, in the prior opportunities for intervention that were not seized. When the love was broad and genuine and expressed at scale across a city of millions. Both things were true simultaneously, and the coexistence of that systemic failure and that communal love is part of what made the case so devastating to follow. Because the love came when it was too late, and the failure came when intervention might have mattered, and the gap between them is where Maleah was. The Amber Alert system, in which we discussed in the context of the Adam Walsh case, and which was built substantially on the legislative infrastructure that followed Walsh's murder, functioned as designed in Maleah's case. The alert was issued quickly once law enforcement had the information they needed. The broadcast reached millions of people across multiple platforms. The public response was immediate and genuine. And what the Amber Alert could not do, what no alert system can do, is travel backward in time to the moments before the crime. An Amber Alert is a response mechanism. It functions in the aftermath. The child it seeks has already been taken, already harmed, already removed from the safety she should have had. The alert asks the public to be the final line of defense for a child who has already passed through every prior line without being caught. The prior lines in Maleah's case were the lines that were supposed to catch her. The father's reports, the CPS involvement, the existing knowledge about conditions in the home that, in retrospect, should have been weighted more heavily than they were. These are the lines that are harder to build and harder to maintain and harder to fund than an alert system, must because they require sustained attention and sustained resources applied to situations that are not yet crises and may never become crises and cannot, in real time, be reliably distinguished from the ones that will. This is the structural challenge of Child Protective Services work across the United States. It is a challenge that Maleah Davis's case illustrates with particular clarity because the prior involvement was documented and the concerns were documented and the outcome was the worst possible outcome. And the gap between the documentation and the outcome is a gap that policy reform is supposed to close. Texas, in the years before Maleah's death, had been involved in ongoing reform efforts related to its CPS system. A series of lawsuits and consent decrees had pushed the state toward improvements in caseload management, training, and outcome monitoring. And progress had been made, measured in reduced caseloads and improved training protocols, and better documentation practices. The system was better in 2019 than it had been in 2013. It was not yet good enough for Maleah. The specific caseworkers involved in prior contacts with the family were not publicly identified or individually prosecuted. The system's accountability was institutional rather than personal, which is the usual form that accountability takes when the failure is one of resource allocation and structural capacity rather than individual malice. No caseworker decided to let Maleah die. What happened was less dramatic and more systemic. Decisions were made within constraints that made better decisions difficult. And the cumulative effect of those constrained decisions was that a 4-year-old child was left in a situation that turned fatal. Quinnell X, she whose role in the case attracted considerable attention, has spoken extensively about his conversation with Vince and about what prompted him to seek it. His account reflects a pragmatic understanding of human psychology and of the specific conditions under which people who have been lying will sometimes choose to stop. He understood that Vince had been sitting with the truth for weeks, that the formal interrogation setting had not created the conditions for that truth to emerge, and that a different kind of conversation, more direct, less institutional, more personal, might reach something that the official process had not reached. Whether that calculation was correct is something that the result speaks to, Vince told him. Whatever Quinnell X said in that room and whatever Vince felt in response to it, the outcome was a confession that led to the recovery of Maleah's remains and the certainty of prosecution. And the formal system had done its job in arresting Vince and building the evidence of evidence tampering. The informal conversation did something the formal system had not done. It produced an admission from the person responsible and a location. The remains were found near Hope, Arkansas, a town whose name, in the context of this case, takes on an almost unbearable irony. The remains were in a wooded area near Interstate 30, in a bag, in the kind of location that a person chooses when they are hoping that what they have placed there will not be found. Vince had driven from Houston to Arkansas after Maleah's death. He had chosen a location that was distant from where he lived, in a different state, along a stretch of highway that offered the isolation he was looking for. He had underestimated the investigation, and he had underestimated Quinnell X. And he had underestimated what happens when a city decides that a 4-year-old girl in a purple outfit is not someone the world will simply forget. The forensic examination of Maleah's remains was conducted with the thoroughness that a capital murder case requires. The findings established the cause of death and the manner of death with the specificity that prosecution demands. The details were presented to a grand jury that returned the capital murder indictment And they would have been presented in full at trial had the case gone to trial. The guilty plea spared everyone that specific experience, the detailed public presentation of what a 4-year-old child endured at the hands of the adult who was supposed to protect her, and the trade-off was the certainty of a life sentence without the finality of a jury verdict. Some families prefer trials, some families prefer pleas, and the preferences exist in the specific context of what each family has already endured, what they believe they can endure further, and what form of resolution they believe will best serve the memory of the person they lost. Maleah's family navigated that choice under circumstances that no family should have to navigate, and whatever their private calculation, the outcome, Darian Vent's sentence to life without parole, represents a legal accountability that, in however incomplete as a form of justice, at least guarantees that he will not have the opportunity to harm another child. The sentencing was September 2020. The courtroom was attended by family members and community representatives, by people who had searched for Maleah, and people who had covered the story, and people who had followed it from their homes across Houston and across the country. The judge imposed the life sentence with the weight that such sentences carry, not with ceremony, and not with the drama that fiction has taught us to expect from courtroom moments, but with the quiet authority of the law doing the specific thing it exists to do. Vence was let out of the courtroom. He will not be released. The case, in the formal legal sense, is closed. Maleah Davis has not been forgotten in Houston. Her name has been used in advocacy. Her face has been invoked in legislative testimony. The community that searched for her continues to carry her in various ways. In the conversations about Child Protective Services reform, in the volunteer organizations that do search and recovery work, in the specific memories of the people who were in those fields and along those roadsides in the spring of 2019, looking for a little girl they had never met. Her father, Craig Davis, has channeled his grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about the failures that preceded her death and about what he believes needs to change. He carries her with him into those conversations. He speaks about her as a father, with a specific texture of someone who knew a real child rather than a statistic, which is exactly the kind of witness that policy conversations need and rarely have. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, built substantially on the advocacy legacy of the Adam Walsh case, it processed the alert for Maleah Davis and contributed to the search coordination in the days when a living child was still the working hypothesis. The infrastructure that John Walsh spent decades building was present and functioning when Maleah needed it. The infrastructure could not save her because she had already been killed before the alert was issued, but it functioned as designed, and it produced the community mobilization that it was built to produce. Well, there is something both encouraging and heartbreaking in that. Encouraging because the infrastructure works. Heartbreaking because the infrastructure is a response mechanism, and what Maleah needed was not a response but a prevention, and prevention requires different infrastructure entirely. The kind that is harder to build, harder to fund, and harder to measure, and that rarely produces the visible, immediate, emotionally legible results that response mechanisms produce. Building that prevention infrastructure is the ongoing work of child welfare advocates, legislators, caseworkers, and community organizations across the country. It is work that proceeds incrementally in budget hearings and training sessions and policy revisions and individual caseworker decisions about how to prioritize a caseload that is too large and a time budget that is too small. It is work that rarely produces a moment as visible as a convicted murderer being led from a courtroom. It produces instead the absence of harm, the child who was at risk and was not harmed, the family that was in crisis and was stabilized, the situation that was dangerous and was made less so before anyone got hurt. Absence of harm does not make the news. It does not generate Amber Alerts or search parties or community vigils. It is invisible in the way that prevention is always invisible, present only in the outcome that did not occur. In the story that did not get told because nothing happened, because a caseworker with a manageable caseload made a good decision with sufficient time and information, and a child who needed help received it. That is what Maleah Davis deserved. Not the story that got told. The story that should have gone untold because nothing bad happened. She deserved unremarkable safety. She deserved to be invisible to the news cycle because there was nothing to report. She deserved to grow up in a world that protected her quietly and without drama, the way the world is supposed to protect its 4-year-olds. We did not give her that. The obligation, the specific, practical, policy-level obligation, is to give it to the children who come after her. Maleah Davis, August 2nd, 2014. April 26th, 2019. 4 years old. She loved purple. She had a laugh that people remembered. She had already fought so hard to be here. Some losses cannot be made meaningful by what follows them. Some children cannot be given back to the world in any form, cannot be transformed into symbols or legislation or change, without the transformation itself feeling like another theft. Maleah deserved to be unremarkable. She deserved to grow up without her name becoming a lesson. She deserved, most of all, to be just a child, loud and stubborn and funny and alive, in a world safe enough to let that happen. We did not give her that world. We owe the children who come after her the effort of building it. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.